Hey everyone, did you know Windows Server 2025 is coming out soon? And did you also know that there is a whole plethora, yes, I said plethora, of security enhancements coming out in Windows Server 2025? Now, there's a lot centered around Windows Active Directory on premises and lots more. So I've got Paul Schnackenberg on the show today, and we're going to go through the entire list of security enhancements in Windows Server 2025. And yes, it is that long that it necessitates an entire episode of this show. So that and lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm Podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got, our regular recurring guest. I've got Paul Schnackenberg on. How's it going, Paul?
I'm pretty good, Andy. How are you? I think I'm going to be classified as a co-host soon.
You know, I was going to say, at some point, we're going to have to classify you as a co-host because we have you on so frequently. So at some point, we're going to have that conversation, right? But, you know, you're always my Microsoft and M365 guy, right? Anytime there's something happening in the Microsoft security space or something new in M365, you're my guy. And, well, like the last 6 months, I can't go a couple of days without there being some crazy Microsoft news, right? So
yeah,
I certainly think that's part of it. But while it seems like most of our previous episodes, we were kind of talking on a negative point of view, right? Like something bad was happening. We're actually going to talk about some cool stuff today, right?
Yes. Yeah, we're going to talk about some new stuff, which is really, really nice. I mean, it has been a little bit too much of Microsoft bashing in the last, 4 or 5 sessions we've done. So it'd be nice to move on to something new.
Indeed. And, it was not our intention for it to come off that way. And it was all meant as valid, constructive criticism, right? You know, and
very much so.
Certainly what Microsoft does impacts society. So I think it's a valid conversation. But anyway, today we are talking about all of the nifty and cool security improvements coming in Windows Server 2025. So historically, we've spent most of our time talking about the public cloud, 365. We're going to talk about on-premise for an episode. I think we have one other on-prem-ish type episode. I want to say it was in the 20s somewhere. Eric Siren and I talked about on-premise security versus cloud security in kind of an abstract terms, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so I will be sure to put that in the show notes if you folks are interested. But today we're focusing on Windows Server 2025. So what do you think, Paul? Should we get into it here? We've got, while I'm looking through this outline, we've got quite a bit to talk about.
We do.
Yeah. I think we should start with the big one. And I have not seen or heard of any major updates to this product in quite some time. And I, of course, am talking about Active Directory. Active Directory domain services on-prem. So for those old and gray IT pros and veterans out there like Paul and myself, you've probably used AD before. If you've never used AD, it is the identity mechanism for on-premises data centers and infrastructure, right? So, it's been a long time since I've had to explain what Active Directory is, right, Paul? Probably the same for you. And I mean, go ahead.
Maybe if you're a cloud native organization and you started a few years ago, you maybe haven't touched Active Directory, but in any business it was around, I don't know, at least 5 to 10 years ago, I think they're all running Active Directory. Like there hasn't really been any serious competitors on premises to Active Directory. So Microsoft has done some work here, and it's very interesting. So the domain and forest functional level, which is what you can sort of upgrade to. There used to be like a new one of those every time there was a new version of Windows Server, but nothing has happened. They're now going to version 10, but nothing has happened since version 7, which came out in Windows Server 2016. So we're talking like 8 years ago or something. So now they have a new a domain and forest functional level. So for those of you who are Active Directory aficionados, you know that you're going to have to do an upgrade, which in the sense of Active Directory means you're going to introduce new Server 2025 domain controllers into your environment. And then eventually you're going to replace all of your existing domain controllers with the new domain controllers running on Server 2025. And when that happens, you can then swap over to the new domain and forest functional level. So that's sort of the steps. And the things that we get is the big one really is the JET database that underlies Active Directory, which has had 8K page size since 2000, since Active Directory came out. And for the first time ever, they're changing that page size to 32K, which means that you now get much more efficient database access. And even if you have upgraded all your domain controllers to Server 2025, they will still be in 8K compatibility mode until you enable this as a new feature. Enable-AD optional feature is the PowerShell command to make that happen.
Right. I look at this and I'm like, we're taking a database format that hasn't been updated for 24 years now, and they're making changes. I'm sure it's been updated in minor ways, right? I can't say that definitively, but we haven't seen a major update to it, to my knowledge, in some time. So it's good to see here. And I have to say, just commentary, cool. the PowerShell commandlet, very PowerShell-esque, right? Enable AD optional features. So pretty easy to figure out there.
It's very obvious. Like if you haven't seen it before, you could probably figure out what it does, which is what we love about PowerShell. Very cool. A bunch of little features here to mention. They've got better security on the AD attributes on objects themselves. There's better auditability in the logs of what has been changed on specific attributes. LDAP is the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. There used to actually be a DAP, a Directory Access Protocol, which was not lightweight, which is why nobody used it. So now we're all using LDAP to talk to Active Directory. So if you have an app that does queries against Active Directory, for example, it's going to use the LDAP protocol. So they are binding the channels here. It's going to prefer encryption. The signing of the packets on the LDAP protocol is on by default, and overall the LDAP protocol supports TLS 1.3, the latest version of transport layer security, or what we used to call SSL. Right. You can't change your password remotely over any legacy protocols, so you have to use Kerberos. The automatically generated passwords for computer accounts can no longer contain the computer name itself, which is really, really cool. And in a hey, let's get rid of some really, really, really old cruft. The DC locator protocol, which does exactly what you think it would, right? You fire up a client, it goes, hey, I need to talk to a domain controller to authenticate against the domain. Where's my domain controllers? I'm going to locate them. They actually use something called the mail slots protocol. That is like 30 plus years old protocol. And it's text-based, and it's just like terrible from a security point of view. So they're actually getting rid of that, which is very, very cool.
A lot of this stuff, as I'm looking at it, kind of screams zero trust to me, kind of that whole idea of assume breach, right? LDAP preferring encryption, changing passwords over legacy protocols being blocked, mail slots protocol no longer being used. I mean, all of that kind of goes hand in hand with that zero trust approach we've been hearing for all these years, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably also overall, I'd say that all these Active Directory improvements are really Microsoft looking at all the cases when organizations get owned, because realistically, and if you're outside of security, you might not even know this, but most attackers, when they get into an organization, they will compromise Active Directory in that organization and achieve domain dominance, being domain administrators, within 48 hours. Right. And a lot of that is because it is a lot of crafty old technology, right? So introducing all these new features, fingers crossed it's going to make life better for the defenders. The other big thing I think that's quite cool is NUMA support. So non-uniform memory access is a technology that's been around for many, many years, but it's gained more prominence in the last, I don't know what, 5, maybe 10 years, something like that. So when you buy a new server today, you go to Dell or HP or whoever, and you buy a big server, or even a small server, medium server, it'll have, 64, 128, 256, 512 gigs of RAM or whatever, and then you just scale up depending on the size of your credit card limit from there. And it'll have a bunch of physical CPUs. So you might have, 1 or 2 physical CPUs or 4 or whatever, and then they'll have a bunch of cores on them. Now, physically, the way a server motherboard is laid out, all the server's CPUs, physical CPUs, will not have the same high-speed access to all the memory. So you end up with, like, this physical CPU sees these 256 gigs of memory, or 128, depending on the motherboard and the size of it. This CPU sees the other 256, right? So overall, your machine has 2 physical CPUs and half a terabyte of RAM, but when the application is running on some of those CPU cores on one, if they try to access memory that is slower access from the other CPU, you get performance weirdness. So applications that are NUMA aware, such as Hyper-V, of course, and SQL Server and Exchange Server and a few others, and then third-party applications running on Windows Server, they know how to sort of query the underlying platform to figure out what NUMA node am I running on, how much memory can I access safely that's going to give me good performance. And Active Directory didn't used to be NUMA aware. So it literally only used one CPU. Now, and that could be multiple cores, obviously, but one physical CPU. So now it's NUMA aware. So now it actually will be much more efficient on a large server. And they did talk about one of the large environments that one of their clients have, which has 1,200 domain controllers. And the ntds.dit database file is over 100 gigabytes in size. So when you have that sort of environment, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of users that is, but when you have that sort of environment, you want to use all the grunt in your servers. Oh, and quick note, if they're virtualized servers, whether on VMware or Hyper-V, they do virtual NUMA, so they will project into the VM, hey, this is the hardware platform you're running on, this is the size of your NUMA nodes, and then they will adapt to that.
Right. Yeah, Hyper-V has been using NUMA for some time, so it's nice to see that technology being used elsewhere, for sure. And I got to say, 1,200 DCs. I don't want to be the guy managing that. That is a lot of DCs. Holy smokes.
Yeah, that's a large environment. Yeah, that's I wouldn't want to either.
Indeed.
Right.
The next big item on the list is delegated managed service accounts, right? You want to give us the rundown on that, Paul?
Absolutely. These are very cool, and I'll let you weigh in on what it looks like in Enter ID as a comparison. So, for a long time in Active Directory, we've had service accounts, which is basically just a user account. So I can remember 10, 15 years ago, you install a server application, SQL or something, and it needs to run on the server, so it needs to have an account to run under. So you just create an account, call it SQL service account or whatever, give it a nice long password, and set the password to never expire, because that makes your life easier, because the app is never going to stop working. And then you just run the app under that account, right? Great. Easy peasy, job done. Except, of course, those service accounts are really juicy targets for attackers, because they generally get very high permissions. I mean, I can remember long before security was a thing, you just made it a domain admin account because you knew that the app was going to work, so you didn't worry about anything else, right? So obviously Microsoft tried to fix this.
And I got to jump in. I have to say, it was quite common for many third-party vendors' system requirements to state the service account had to have admin permissions, right? We pull our hair out thinking about that today, but that's just the way it was. It was the Wild West, man.
It was. It was. So, of course, Microsoft has been trying to tackle this problem for quite a few years. So, in several versions of Windows Server, we had managed service accounts, which is where you can set Active Directory to maintain the password of this thing, change it regularly, and make it long and secure. But only certain applications supported that, and you could only use managed service accounts, MSAs, on one server at a time. So if you had a distributed application that needed to run in multiple places, now you end up with multiple accounts. Not brilliant. So then they came up with group managed service accounts, so GMSAs. They're still around today, but they need support from the application. So things like Defender for Identity and a few other applications I can think of do use GMSAs, but they're specifically written to do it. And I know one of my clients wanted to install a smart card app thing that integrated with Active Directory. And I said, oh, do you use group managed service accounts? Because their list of requirements was we need a service account with these permissions. And they were like, oh, that sounds cool. And then I figured out that, no, you got to write for it. So unless you guys are willing to do the software development to make that happen, it's not going to happen. So now Microsoft has come up with a much better solutions. So delegated managed service accounts, or DMSAs, they don't have passwords. They use keys. So there's a key exchange between the server or Active Directory and the server where the account is running. And the beautiful thing is you can upgrade an existing service account. So if you have a service account today, even if it's just an ordinary user account, you can literally upgrade this, and it's a couple of step process in PowerShell. And what you end up with is an account that has no value to an attacker, because the keys are not something you can use to authenticate with. And because you can take an existing account, you don't need to change the application. This will work for any application, and the application keeps on running. Like literally, it just keeps on running throughout this process. And you can do it in stages, so you can sort of back off if something does happen, something doesn't work properly. You can back off and then turn it back into sort of like an ordinary user account. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So somebody really sat down and thought, how do we fix this problem permanently? And I think this, well, provided you have all your domain controllers on Windows Server 2025, this is a beautiful solution for all your service accounts.
Right. And you mentioned earlier, there's some parallels here I see between managed identity and delegated managed service accounts, right? And specifically when you say that DMSA is designed to use keys. So it wasn't that long ago, I just did a demo where I was using a system account managed identity, SAMI, I guess is the acronym, to basically access credentials stored in a Azure Key Vault without using a username and password. And it functions very much the same way, right? So you basically go into Azure Entra, and you are essentially telling Entra, like, hey, this system that the system account managed identity is tied to is a trusted system. And then from that point forward, in order for that system to get access to anything, it uses a generated token, right? And then same thing with user account managed identity. I shouldn't say same thing with user account managed identity, slightly different process, but that's more designed for you have a managed identity object that needs to access multiple resources, whereas a system account managed identity is more of like a single system needs to access, some resources. So very similar concept. Yep. And part of me wonders if, DMSA, they took some of I know this is a Microsoft word, they took some of the learnings from managed identity and pulled it down into the on-premises product, right? Which is nice to see.
I think so. And I think there's several other areas where that will pop up as well in today's conversation, because you can clearly see how a lot of the stuff that they do in Azure, where they run at scale, in case you happen to listen to this podcast but not know, all of Azure runs on Hyper-V, which all runs on Windows Server. So, there's a lot of technologies coming from one to the other, like hot patching. We're going to talk about that later.
Yep.
So moving on, Kerberos, of course, is the authentication protocol. So when I used to teach at the local college here many years ago, or some years ago, I always talked about Fluffy, the three-headed dog from Harry Potter. Everybody knew that. Well, they did back in the day when Harry Potter was
Right.
new. And then I said,
Right.
well, we stole that from Cerberus or Kerberos, the three-headed dog that guards the river Styx in Greek mythology to the gates to hell. And that's the Kerberos protocol that we have in Active Directory and has had since Windows Server 2000 came out. Now, what they've done is they've made it pluggable. So the encryption protocols have become pluggable so that they can swap out and put in new ones as they come out.
Yep.
So they now have quantum safe algorithms in there, and they're getting rid of RC4 and MD5, which is all related to Kerberos thing, which you can look up, which is an attack type for Active Directory. Sorry, I was interrupting.
No worries. And I'm glad you brought that up. And I also saw in the What's New in Windows Server 2025 blog post, they're pulling in SHA-256 and SHA-384 as well for supported cryptography algorithms, which is always nice to see. And I just had a comment to make. I looked up this was some years ago, 5-10 years. I don't remember what. I'm like, Kerberos. Like, where did they get the name from, right? Well, and so, I discovered that connection to Greek mythology. And that got me thinking, right? And this is a bit of a sidebar, but I have to get it out there. Okay, Kerberos is guarding, the gates to hell, right? So, why? So it implies that, the identity mechanisms that it's protecting is hell, right? So I guess depending on your outlook on identity management, maybe that's accurate. I don't know, but I always thought that was funny.
Well,
Sorry,
you could get hold of one of the administrators who's managed that 1200 domain controller environment to see what they say, whether they think it's hell or not, because I could see that being the case. We move on to NTLM. So, New Technology LAN Manager. So before there was Kerberos, like in Windows, properly forever. Like LAN Manager was Microsoft's server file sharing product before Windows NT 351. So we're talking a long time ago. Now, of course, this is not used in modern Windows when they talk to each other. Like if you have a Windows Server 2022 talking to a Windows 11 client, they don't use it, but there might be applications that do. And it turns out that there's a bunch of old crafty code inside a Windows Server that still falls back to this in certain scenarios. So Microsoft is doing a concerted effort, which is much bigger than Windows Server 2025, of getting off NTLM overall. And we're talking here about NTLM version 1, version 2, and the old LAN manager itself. They're all called just NTLM. Let's get rid of them. So there's 4 parts of this. There's the IA Kerberos. I'll leave you to read more about that. You have a local key distribution center. So if you have like 3 or 4 Windows 11 machines, or Windows 10 even, but Windows 11 machines that are talking to each other, traditionally they would use NTLM because they don't have a domain controller to talk to when they're authenticating to each other. Now they will literally get like a mini Active Directory or a key distribution center in each client machine that will generate Kerberos keys so that these machines are authenticating against each other and authenticating user accounts using local key distribution center and using Kerberos. Another scenario where it would fall back to NTLM was if you had a service account that was pointing to an IP address rather than a name. So with a name, you could enter that name into DNS, and then you could have a name lookup, and it would all work. But an IP address would always go, well, I'm going to have to fall back to NTLM. So now they have an try IPSPN. So it's going to figure you're going to have can have the names in with IP addresses, and it's going to still use Kerberos for that. And the final one is move to negotiate. So it turns out that a lot of the applications that sort of still fall back to NTLM, third-party ones, is because they were just hard-coded to do that. They could actually do Kerberos, but they're just hard coded to use NTLM, and nobody's ever managed or bothered to go back and change the code. So they're moving to negotiate to sort of force these applications to just try try Kerberos, because if you can, it'll be good, and if the destination can talk Kerberos, you'll all be good. And they will have, which is, I think it's interesting. So Ned Pyle, principal program manager at Microsoft, he's been on this warpath to get rid of SMB1 for a really long time. So they had a web page where they were literally naming and shaming organizations that were still demanding SMB1. Well, they're going to do the same thing for anything that's still demanding NTLM, so that they get named and shamed, and they can go in, and it's literally just a minor change to the code to say, just try to do Kerberos, and if you can, we're all good.
Yep, exactly. And I think NTLM, one of those protocols that it's been on the way out long enough. Like, we're at that point in time where we need to name and shame, right? And I mean, if you look at any popular password cracking tool in the world, there are all kinds of NTLM templates in there, or presets for the various NTLM versions. Most, if not all, NTLM versions do not salt their hash. So therefore, they're susceptible to rainbow table attacks, So, I mean, they're really easy to crack just because of that. So anytime I see NTLM in use, I'm like, let's get rid of it right now,
yeah. Like, it's terrible. I think one of the other things off the top of my head now, but I think it also, if you have a longer password than 16 characters, it truncates it to 16 characters, or even 15 characters from memory. So and it all converts it to uppercase, I think. So even if you have a mixed lower and uppercase, it was built for 30 years ago. It's certainly not built for today.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're removing an entire case of your letter set, you've instantly cut your possible entropy in half just because of that, right? So, oh, good times. So happy to see NTLM on the way out.
Yeah. This is a good one, and it's a good one. Then we have baselines. So we've had baselines for quite a few years, obviously, both for client and server. One of the things they're introducing in Windows Server 2025, which is pretty cool, is drift management. So it used to be that you applied a baseline, I don't know, using Intune or a third-party MDM or a GPO. On server side, it's harder because there can't be MDM enrolled. So you probably were using group policies or some other third-party mechanism to apply them. Right. Now you have the drift management built in, so that if some junior tech comes around, 2 months later and makes changes, it's actually going to notice that and put the security back to how you want it to be in your baselines, which is very, very cool. They have added a 2-second delay on SMB authentication, so server message block, the file sharing protocol. So if you're trying to brute force a password, you get one try every 2 seconds. And there were some demos at the Windows Server Summit, which we'll link to in the show notes, where without this thing, you could do sort of like, off the top of my head again, 500, 700, 1,000 tries per second on modern hardware. And having to do one try every 2 seconds for brute forcing really, really slows it all down.
Indeed. Yeah, that's a nice change as well. And they've made a whole litany of improvements here for SMB directly, which is nice to see. So like the next one, SMB signing enabled by default, which is fantastic. I don't know why we haven't done that sooner.
It does have a little bit of a performance overhead, I think, which is probably why Microsoft has been slowly introducing it. So it's been optional for a while. Now it's on by default. They also have the SMB dialect control, so you can define which SMB versions you are happy to talk to or not talk to. Which then brings us over to the QUIC protocol. So the QUIC protocol actually comes from Google originally, or the spec for it. It is in some ways a reaction to government spying. And there's a whole history behind here, which we don't have time to go into here. But the interesting thing about the QUIC protocol is it actually runs in the user mode part of an operating system, whether we're talking Linux or Windows. because it makes logging and monitoring much harder. And that's the idea. The problem is, though, and we haven't seen this yet, but if the Russians and the Chinese get tired of just doing ransomware and ordinary spying, and they turn to Quick, what you get is literally you can run an app in just an app that you just install on your operating system, which can then do network traffic, which essentially is invisible to the operating system because it doesn't come from the kernel, it doesn't go through the kernel network stack. So that's a little bit of a thing. But other than that, the Quick protocol is very handy. So in earlier versions, you could only use this on the Azure edition of Windows Server, and you could only use it when it was hosted in Azure or on Azure Stack. Now it's going to be in all editions of Windows Server 2025, Standard, Data Center, and Azure Edition. They've added mutual authentication with a certificate. You can change the port that it uses. And what this basically means, what happens with SMB over Quick, is that you can have a Windows file server on-prem or in Azure or in a third-party cloud that is hosting file shares. So when your users are sitting on-prem in their Windows machines or Mac machines and they're connecting to this file share, it all works as per normal. When they pick up their machine, their laptop, and they go to a public Wi-Fi, let's say, or home, normally what would happen is it would say, well, you can't see the file server, right? You can't get to it. So you would have to have some sort of VPN connection here or some other solution. Well, what SMB over Quick is going to do is going to try to connect normally, going to fail, and then because you have set up SMB over Quick for this particular file server / file share, it will just connect over UDP, over the internet, completely transparently, and securely over TLS 1.3. So you get like a VPN-less connection to all your file shares. And there are even Quick clients for Android. So you could have like your Android phone or tablet connecting to a file share from outside of your network completely securely.
It's a nice protocol for that. And it's been a while since I've personally done anything with it, but wasn't that, I want to say a year or two back, another Microsoft MVP, buddy of mine, Didier Van Hoy, and we did a webinar specifically on this topic, and he did some really cool demos with Quick or SMB over Quick. So definitely a cool protocol. And if I can find that old webinar, I don't know how relevant it still is, but the demos are worth seeing because he actually proves that, hey, this is happening via an encrypted session. Like you can't see the traffic, right? So sometimes that type of stuff, especially VPN-less, it's one of those things that some admins just have to see it in use, right? So I'll link that in the show notes in case anybody wants to take a look at it. So next is one I'm particularly excited about, and that is hot patching. Fantastic. Why don't you give us the details, Paul?
Right. So coming back to things that Microsoft does in Azure and that then trickle down to Windows Server, this is one of them. So basically, Microsoft has, by this stage, probably many millions of physical servers in Azure. They all run Hyper-V, and they all need to be patched. And just like everybody else, there's Patch Tuesday, patches come out, they've got to be applied. But of course, you don't want to reboot your client's VM loads running in Azure. So they've come up with hot patching. Basically, it applies the patch in memory so that the functions that were pointing to the vulnerable code in the past, and this is only security patches, not performance and other bug fixes. This is only security patches. So the function that would point to a particular part of the code is sort of redirected to the new patch. So it all happens in memory. So the way it works, so this has been around since Windows Server 2019, I think. It was only in Core Edition. In Server 2022, came in Azure Edition, but you had to run it on Azure or Azure Stack HCI. Now it is in all versions of Windows Server. So the way it works is this. You apply a baseline patch, which does require a reboot. So let's say we do that in January. Now, when February's patch comes around, it's going to automatically go to Windows Update or WSOS or however you get your patches. It's going to get this special version of this patch and apply it. And it will literally take a few seconds because the code is much smaller, because it's only what needs to be applied, and it's applied directly in memory, and there's no reboot required. So then February and March, you get no reboot. You just server keeps on running, everything's fine, you're patched against security issues. And then 4 times a year, so the next quarter comes around, you get a new baseline patch, which will require a reboot. So instead of doing 12 reboots a year, you're doing 4 reboots a year, which is kind of nice. Now, the only other thing to mention here is that if there is a security update to the .NET framework, then this just no longer holds true because they don't do hot patching yet. They're working on it, but they don't do it yet, which means that if you apply a .NET patch, security patch, you're still going to have to reboot. Now, in Server 2025, all editions, you get hot patching with no cost if you're running on Azure or Azure Stack HCI. If you're running it on premises or in AWS, the server needs to be Arc connected, but you get a bunch of other benefits from that, and there is a small monthly fee. They haven't revealed what the small monthly fee is, but there you are.
And they're always quite... They play those cards very close to the chest until it's officially announced, but I can't imagine it would be all that much. I mean, there's going to be a small fee just for the Arc connectivity piece of it. I forget what that is off the top of my head, a couple of bucks per machine per month. So it says Arc connected plus small monthly fee. So it'd be whatever the Arc fee is plus this mysterious small monthly fee. So anyway, worth it for...
I don't think Microsoft... exactly. We'll see when it's released. I don't know that, I don't think this is going to be a big money spinner for Microsoft. I think they're just charging for the service per se. All right, we move on to the resilient file system, to REFS. So we have had NTFS in Windows for way over 25 years by now. REFS have, of course, been around for, I think, about a decade. So there is something called confidential computing. So today, we're all used to encrypting data at rest. You use BitLocker on your laptop. Your servers are disk encrypted. That makes sense, right? Somebody steals the hardware, they can't get to the data. We also all used to protecting data in transit. So between systems, we use either TLS or some other kind of encryption. So if somebody listens into the wire, all they get is encrypted data. But what hasn't happened until recently is confidential computing, protecting data while it's in use. So while it's being read by the processor and actually processed and then written back to memory, it used to be all in clear text. Now that's an issue if you're doing, say, public cloud computing, so you're hosting in AWS or Azure or wherever. You mightn't want any administrators in those environments to be able to see what's going on inside your code. There could also be multi-part scenarios. So you have 4 different hospitals. They all have patient data that they want to crunch in an AI algorithm to come up with a diagnosis help. And they could make it much better if they could pool their patient data together, but they don't want to share their patient data with somebody else. So you can have a program do the processing, and nobody can see each other's data, but the output algorithm will then be available for all 4 hospitals, as an example.
Right.
So confidential computing has been around in Azure for quite some years now, and I've written quite a few articles on it. It's a very cool technology. However, relying on the NTFS file system, and you can also run this on-prem, right? Like if you buy the AMD or Intel processors that support confidential computing, you can do this on-prem as well. Now, traditionally, what you would use is your operating system disk, for example, would be NTFS. Now, it turns out there are replay attacks here. So the problem is that you could take a snapshot or a backup of a VM that's running confidential computing, and then you could trick the system by loading something that was from that snapshot or from a backup, and then you could access the encrypted systems when you shouldn't be able to, sort of thing. So they've come up with the REFS file system for this, which you didn't used to be able to run for your operating system disk. Now you can. It gets SHA-256 checksums for both the metadata and all file data. So it will know that the disk drive really is the disk drive that you expect to be.
Right.
And because you're using generation 2 VM with a virtual UEFI, etc., it's going to provide rollback protection. So it's going to detect if somebody has tampered with those disks as part of measured boot, which is very cool.
Yeah, so we're further securing the entire, not only the boot process, but just the processing of data as well. So, I mean,
Yep.
especially in the backup and recovery space, we always talk about, data encrypted in transit and at rest, but nobody stops to think about what is happening to the data as it's being processed, right? So maybe you and I need to do a whole episode just on confidential compute at some point, Paul, because that's a topic I've kind of been thinking
That'd
about
be
for a
cool.
while. For sure.
Yeah, yes, that's a good idea. It's a cool one.
Indeed.
And then let's give all administrators a hernia or a stroke here. So you will be able to take a Windows Server 2022 server, go to Windows Server Updates, and go to Feature Updates. And click Upgrade to Windows Server 2025, just like you can do with the Windows 11 from 23H1 to 23H2 or something. You could just upgrade it. Now, before you have your stroke, you can actually control this with group policy, so your junior admins aren't going around and upgrading your servers willy-nilly just by clicking a button in the UI. So, but it's going to come, which is kind of cool.
I don't know if it's the gray beer admin in me or not, but and I've tested the in-place upgrade feature that it's been around for a few versions now, I think since 2019, and it works. But there's just something in my DNA about upgrading in place on a server. It's just like, I don't know. I've always been a lift and shift kind of guy,
Yeah, well, I actually have. I have production servers at my clients that have been upgraded twice, actually. I think from 16 to
Nice.
19. No, from 12 to 16 to 19, and they're still working. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm braver than you, or stupider. More stupid. So
I think you're braver. You're certainly not stupider than me.
maybe.
You're braver than I am, though.
Oh, I've done some silly things as an administrator.
We
But that's
all
another
have.
podcast, I think.
I was going to say, all the silly things we've done in our careers, I have quite a few. So that is a whole episode in and of itself.
We could exactly. We could do a podcast on that. All right, let's round it off with extended security updates. So for those of you who don't know, so normally a Windows server or a SQL server has a 10-year supported state, so 5 years mainstream support, then 5 years extended support. Once it goes out of that, so things like Server 2012 and Server 2012 R2 are now out of extended support. So you can now get extended security updates for them. If you just have servers on-prem, you're going to be paying through the nose for that, and the price goes up every year. But if you have volume licensed ARC connected machines and they are running on Azure, obviously, or in Azure Stack HCI on-prem, you will get extended security updates as part of that package without having to pay for it, which is kind of nice.
Indeed.
So the last thing really to round off the whole podcast on is, when is Windows Server 2025 going to come out? And in all the different sessions at the Windows Server Summit, there was a lot of talk about, the people were cagey about it. They were like, oh, later in the year, Q4, can't tell you, Satya will punch me in the face. And then there was one session from the System Center, the System Center 2025 presentation, a single session. And the guy said, well, last version, we came out 6 months after the new version of Windows Server, and a lot of our enterprise customers weren't happy. So we're going to release System Center 2025 in tandem with Windows Server 2025. Okay, that sounds fine. And then he pops up a slide on his slide deck that says, in September 2024. So if he's right, it could be an oops. It really could be an oops. I think we could look at Windows Server 2025 being released in September of this year.
That would make sense, because then, I'm trying to think back to previous years. So Ignite is in November this year, and it feels like COVID kind of messed things up a little bit, if I remember correctly. But it seems like GA always happens a few months before Ignite, so that would be about the correct time frame. So we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, and then they can make a big hoo-ha over it at Ignite. Yeah, I think that makes sense to me too.
Indeed. Well, Paul, that was quite a lot there. And there was a whole section that we kind of skipped over because I think we're going to do it in favor of it being its own episode. And of course, I'm talking about all of the VMware migration options that Microsoft is taking into account with Windows Server 2025 as well. That is, of course, I think a response to what's going on with Broadcom. And there's a whole security discussion to be had around accelerated and potentially risky migrations. So I think we'll have to do a whole episode just on that as well. So, but we got a full list here. I mean, we got a lot of good improvements here. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting this in the lab and testing it out. But well, Paul, I want to thank you as always for coming out and sharing your time and knowledge with us. It's always good having you on the show, and I'm sure we'll have you back for, it sounds like I got you lined up for 2 more episodes here at least, right? Confidential computing and the one on the security considerations with VMware migration in Server 2025. So we got lots to talk about yet, but thanks as always, my friend. Good having you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, and I hope our audience finds this useful.
Oh, definitely. Those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button if you're watching on the YouTubes. Otherwise, you can find us on all the major podcasting platforms. So chances are, wherever you consume your content, you can find us there. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there. We'll see you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Catch you later.